Good morning. Good morning in the room. Morning downtown. Downtown, got to be there last week. That was awesome. And good morning to all you who are watching online on our different platforms. So glad that you joined us. And we are starting a brand new series today. Many of you have been guessing online what's the series about. It's called Just Christmas. And I'll tell you in a little bit, but I want to start off by telling you about an interview that I was listening to a few weeks ago. And in this interview, it was a pastor, a North American pastor, telling a story of a time he had traveled overseas to another country, and he was meeting there in a village with some church members, and he was working through a translator, and they were asking questions back and forth and learning about things here and him learning about things there and all this stuff. And eventually they asked him this question, and it kind of like the tone kind of changes in the conversation. It's like, this just got serious. And so through the translator, they ask him like, we have this couple that has come to our village. In fact, they escaped their village and they've been living among us, and they've been wondering if they're allowed to be part of our church, like to actually be like formal members of our church. And we're not sure if we should let them, because the reason they live in our village is because they did such a grievous sin in their village that they had to be exiled to our village. Like, so we're kind of like harboring fugitives, so to speak, right? And so like through the translator, he kind of asked so what was this horrible sin that they did? And they're like, they eloped. Like, and he just kind of tried to hide it in his face, but it was like, they eloped? And he's like, what's the problem? And they're like, don't you read your Bible? And he's like, yeah, what's in yours? They're like, well, Jesus tells us to honor our parents. And these people did this without their parents' approval, and they did it. And we don't know if we can even be associated with them. And he just had this moment of realization where he's like, isn't it fascinating that at different times, different cultures read different things and view them differently? And he's like, I just realized in that culture, in our North American society, we believe those words of Jesus. We have just put an expiry date on them, right? We kind of say by 18, and then after that, you're kind of on your own. And then we, play with words and honor, but maybe, whether one was right or the other, the reality is that at every cultural moment, and we're gonna have this on the screen because I think this is so important, every cultural moment has the potential to blind us or numb us from a Jesus truth. And you could debate that one at lunchtime today. Do you think that one's honoring or dishonoring to what Jesus was speaking about? And that'd be a fascinating conversation. But every cultural moment, in every time in history, in every place in history, has the potential to blind us or numb us from a Jesus truth, right? And sometimes we look back on things that have happened in church history. We talk about this often. I think there's something so valuable about looking at history and mistakes that have been done or wins that have happened, right? Because all the time we are realizing in history, we look back in the early church, it's actually recorded in the scriptures of the church kind of saying like, wait, you thought that was a good idea? It's like, well, we just took this cultural principle and brought it into the church. And it's like, no, you can't sleep with your stepmom. That's like no fly zone. How did you think that was a good idea, right? It's just like things got a little blurred with the cultural moment. We fast forward a few weeks ago, we talked about slavery, the way in which Christians viewed slavery. We got that from the culture. We look at the way that the church has sometimes viewed gender, and often the way that culture has oppressed women, sometimes the church has as well. It's like, we don't even want them speaking. We found a verse we're now gonna highlight what's happening in culture, and we forget the fact that the first preachers of the good news of Jesus were actually women running from the tomb. That we forget that. And listen, I'm not choosing a side or anything like that. What I'm saying is that often, our cultural moment blinds us or numbs us from a Jesus truth. And as a pastor, I just be honest with you, this is something that like is exciting to me and torments me all at the same time. Like there are nights where I just lie in bed awake at night thinking, God, what are the things that my cultural blinders are blinding me to? What are the things that I'm encouraging that I should be discouraging? What are the things that I'm discouraging that maybe I should be encouraging, right? Like I just wrestle with that, and that's just me being honest, right? Because I just look at church history and I just realize our cultural blinders we can read the words of Jesus. This is why a few weeks ago we talked about the different boxes and how, people are in different categories, they're worlds apart, and they all claim the Jesus label, right? It's like our cultural moment has the ability to blind us. Like, of course we're on the Jesus side, but what about this? Like, what about that? Right? We just have this way of doing it. And so today, what we're doing as we start our Just Christmas series is we are talking about the fact that there is something about Christmas that rarely gets airtime in our culture. There's something about Christmas that we often don't talk about, right? We talk about Christmas as the birth of God writing himself into human history, living among us, teaching us how to live fully alive, inviting us to make disciples of all nations, giving his life, the resurrection, this incredible exchange so that we can be united to God and live in relationship with him forever. Like we talk about all that at Christmas, but often, it's kind of like a grace and forgiveness entered the world in flesh and blood at Christmas time. And often we forget that in the first century, the cultural view of most of the people who were waiting for a Messiah was one of oppression. That when they stepped out of their doors and they saw Roman soldiers on foot patrol, they remembered and realized that they were unliberated people. That when they walked by wealthy tax collectors, they were reminded that they were oppressed people. That injustice ruled in this time and liberation was a dream. And often the view that the people had of the deities around them actually reinforced the oppression. I love the Sri Lankan scholar Vimuth Ramachandra. He says this, and kind of talking about virtually all ancient cultures. I kind of summarize his words this way. The power of the gods, this is the cultural perspective of the time, was channeled through and identified with the elites of society. Okay, whether that was kings or priests, military captains, it was like they're on the side of God. The elite people have God on their side, and that's why they're elite. And that's why they're powerful. And the outcasts and the oppressed, not so much. In fact, it wasn't uncommon to see people who were despised in society, who were oppressed, as despised by God or being punished by God. In fact, you can visit places in the world today where they still believe that. They'll actually tell you, like, no, don't give to the poor. They're under punishment from the deities. That's actually a belief that has gone throughout all of time at different times. And yet it's interesting because when you open up the scriptures and you read the Hebrew scriptures, the people who had been waiting for a Messiah, you discover a very different view of God. I'm going to read you a few passages. You don't have to turn there now. I'll get you to turn to our main passage in a bit, but I just want to kind of, thought you're going to be on the screen, but Psalm 146. Listen to these words of how different it would have been, a departure from the view of the deities of the world that people were worshiping at the time. Psalm 146:7. He upholds the cause of the oppressed, speaking of God. He upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. The Lord gives sight to the blind. The Lord lifts up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord watches over the foreigner. He sustains the fatherless and the widow, and he frustrates the ways of the wicked. Deuteronomy 10:17-19. This is just a sampling, okay? For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords. What's it saying there? It's like any God that you worship, our God is above them. The great God, mighty and awesome. And then look at this qualifier, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. It's like we need to clarify this because many of the gods showed partiality and accepted bribes. It's like the psalmist is like, no, not our God. Our God's the greatest God, and he doesn't show partiality. He doesn't bend towards the elite and show them favor. In fact, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner, giving him food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. I love the way Tim Keller describes these passages and so many others that are all throughout the scriptures by saying this. It is striking how often God is introduced as defender of these vulnerable groups. It is striking how often God is introduced as defender of these vulnerable groups. Let me ask you a question. Just think about this yourself, or you can write it on the online chat if you'd like. How do you like to be introduced? How do you like to be introduced? I personally, I'm Marc, just Marc, no other title, right? People are like, is it Reverend? Is it Doctor? I'm like, I wish. No, you can just go with Marc. Just Marc, right? And I'm a dad, I'm a husband. Sometimes I try and leave the pastor. I tell you, I try to leave the pastor till later in the conversation because usually that kind of skews it. It's like, oh, right? So, pastor. And then I usually love for people to know when I'm being introduced, somehow for it to get slipped into the conversation, that I'm kind of useless or useful with power tools. Like I know my way around a power tool. Like for me, it's really important. I remember a few months ago, pre-COVID, we had some friends over, Promise and Leah, and we were just chatting. And he pointed to something in our house. I don't even remember what. And he's like, where'd you guys get that? And my wife's like, oh, Marc built it. And he, like, literally, he's like, you built that? And I was like, what do you mean I built? He's like, you know how to like build stuff? And I was like, what? I like escorted him to my garage, showed him my tool belt, showed him my tool, right? Just like, of course. I'm like, and then I was like, what do I look like? Like if you were to get, he's like, I don't know, you kind of look like some guy who just like book nerd. And I was like, what? Anyways, we're no longer friends. No, I'm kidding. But it was just this idea of like, how do you want to be introduced? How do you want people to know you and remember you? Our God identifies with the lowly and the unpowerful. He's the defender of widows and orphans, father to the fatherless. It is striking how often God is introduced as defender of these vulnerable groups. Every time you pick up the scriptures, every time you pick up this book, remember you are holding such a unique history of our God, who is unlike any other deity in the world, unlike any other deity that any other human being has ever dreamed up. He's the true God, God of gods, Lord of lords, and he's the defender of widows and orphans. This is such a unique narrative of the Hebrew people and the view that they had of their God. And this wasn't just the descriptor of who God was. It was the description of who God's people were actually called to be. I want you to turn to the book of Job. I'd love for you to actually turn to the book of Job, chapter 29. And I realize you're probably thinking, you're gonna read from the book of Job at Christmas time? Because those of you that know the book of Job, it's spelled Job. Some of you are like looking for job advice in the book of Job. No, okay, Job, but it's a really depressing book, okay? Job has horrible atrocities happen to him and his family. You read this and it's like, never mind, I feel great about my life, okay? Like horrible things happen. And then the rest of the book is him kind of crying out to God, wrestling with his friends speaking when they should be silent, right? Like if you want advice for how to grieve with people, don't look to Job's friends. They're terrible at it, okay? But in his crying out, Job is actually like saying like, God, why would this happen to me? It's almost like he has this idea that like good people receive good things from the deities. And so therefore like this is unfair that this is happening to me. And I love what one scholar says, because he's like, in a sense, we're kind of getting to read Job's prayer journal where he's just like wrestling with God and laying out like, but God, I've done all these good things. And in fact, as one guy, Francis Anderson, who's a commentator, says, this is one of the most important texts in scripture for the study of Israelite ethics. Because we just get a window into someone saying, no, God, I've done it your way. And so I just want to read chapter 29, verse 11, okay? This is Job's words. He's crying out to God, God, whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me. And then this is why he's like, because I rescued the poor. He's like, I cared about the poor. You care about the poor. I care about the poor, God. I rescued the poor who cried for help, and the fatherless who had none to assist him. The man who was dying blessed me. I made the widow's heart sing. I love that. He's like, I didn't just make sure she had a meal. He's like, I brought her standard of living up so that she was delighting in life to the point where she was singing as she went about her life. He's like, God, I took care of her. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice, we're gonna come back to that word in a bit. Justice was my robe and my turban. He's like, I was dripping in this. You looked at me and you knew that I cared for the poor, God. I was eyes to the blind, feet to the lame. I was father to the needy, not I gave them a handout. He's like, I took on as if they were my own children and I took care of all their needs. I was father to the needy. I took up the case of the stranger. I love this next verse. This is a highlight, underline, circle this. This is so good. We're gonna come back to this in January for our next series. I'm that far ahead in planning. Aren't you impressed? I know, I am. No applause, that's fine. Tough crowd. Gosh. Verse 17, I broke the fangs of the wicked. What is he saying? He's saying I punched their teeth in? No. He's saying the wicked have a way of digging their claws into people, using the systems and structures and power structures around them to oppress and crush the little guy, so to speak. And he's like, not only, he says later, I snatched the victims from their teeth, but he says, first, I broke the oppressive systems and power systems that were within their reach. I broke them. I fought against the injustice systems that were around me, and I rescued the poor from their grip. I'm mind blown when I think of how long ago this was written. This was the way of our God. And this was someone wrestling with God and saying, God, I've lived your way, I don't understand. And that is a great question that many of us have been asking, even up till this week. God, I don't understand why, and didn't I, but it's not how God works. But it just gives us a window into the morality of Israelites. And that word that we talked about, that came up there, like the words in the original language are not mercy, or not compassion, are not generosity. Those aren't the words that describe what's happening with Job. It's a word mishpat. It comes up over 200 times in the Hebrew scriptures, mishpat. You know what mishpat translates to? Justice. Justice. And next week, we're going to deep dive into this idea of justice and all the different ways it played out. But today, let me just use Tim Keller to summarize it really, really succinctly. He says this. He says it means more than just the punishment of wrongdoing. Justice, mishpat, was more than just the punishment of wrongdoing. We often think of justice as police and court systems and prison time and all that. He says it also means to give people their rights. It also means to give people their rights. That's why when you see the word mishpat throughout the Hebrew scriptures, throughout the Old Testament, you expect to see the word justice, that we translate justice, next to the idea of criminal behavior. But you know where you find it? You find it next to what one author called the quartet of the vulnerable, which is widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor. That caring for those people is what is called mishpat, and we translate justice, and we start to realize we have a narrow view and understanding of what justice is. The quartet of the vulnerable, widows, orphans, immigrants, and the poor, these were people who were, if there was ever a crisis, just days away from starvation. They were hand-to-mouth people. If famine, invasion, social unrest, or even pandemic struck, days away from starvation. Today, we might add single parents to that list, the elderly to that list, refugees, the homeless, migrant workers. Some of you thought that was an American problem, and now we realize we have over 60,000 that come and do jobs in our own country that we don't want to do. That's just to name a few. But those are the kinds of people that would fall into the category of what has been called the quartet of the vulnerable. That the way I would summarize it is that Christian justice goes beyond punishment to also caring for the vulnerable. It goes beyond punishment to caring for the vulnerable. It's interesting because when we talk about justice and injustice, we think about a murder getting off on a technicality and we call that unjust. We think of a scam artist who has taken someone's livelihood, get off with a small fine or probation, and we think that's unjust. We think about sexual misconduct and being told sorry, but there's not enough evidence and it's he said, she said, and it's like, that's unjust. We think of someone assaulting another and simply getting a slap on the wrist or probation, and we think that's unjust. And let me tell you, as Jesus people, we believe that is all unjust. We're with that. But Jesus people have a broader vision of injustice, and it includes caring for the vulnerable. And that's regardless of if you feel or think that they need or deserve caring. You won't find that qualifier in Scripture. You won't find that as a qualifier that Jesus gave. This idea of mishpat, the idea of justice, is one all throughout the Scriptures. And so you're starting to think, okay, I think I understand why he's named this series Just Christmas. It's with regards to justice and Christmas, but some of you are wondering, I don't understand why those two are being married together. Like, why is justice and Christmas the theme for this year? Because for so often, we talk about Jesus coming into the world and John the Baptist's announcement, the Lamb of God who's come to take away the sin of the world, and it's all true, and we believe that. Not an ounce of that do we not believe, I promise you. But often we forget the very real reality that this was not just a Savior coming to remove sins of the world, but this was actually justice in flesh and blood. This was the flesh and blood of a God who calls himself the defender of orphans and widows coming to be in the world, showing up on the scene. This is so mission critical. The bottom line is that Christmas is the birth of justice in the world. And that's good news. I think about in Luke 2:10, which is always read on Christmas Eve, isn't it? Right? I bring you good news of great joy that will cause great joy for all people. And all of a sudden that word all has a little bit broader of a meaning when we realize that this was flesh and blood justice stepping into the world. And I ask myself the question, do you think all people think Christmas is good news for all of them as well? Do you think people in other countries think to themselves, wow, 1 billion people, we're approaching December, or now we're in December, and 1 billion people who call Jesus Lord are pausing and celebrating the coming of flesh and blood justice into our world? You think people working in sweatshops, working to, manufacture so many of the things that we buy are thinking, good thing December's around the corner because at least 1 in 7 people in the world are going to pause and think outside of themselves and think about justice. This is probably going to be a quiet time of year. You think delivery drivers, Amazon drivers are thinking to themselves, well, it's a good thing it's December. At least all the Christians are looking outward and not just thinking about themselves. Good thing it's about to slow down a little bit. Do you think, forget about the world, think about our city. Do you think the vulnerable in our city are thinking, good thing that, and forget about all the other churches, good thing that Lakeside, 800-900 people are pausing and celebrating Christmas, the coming of God in the flesh, of defender of orphans and widows and father to the fatherless. Oh, I'm so excited to see what December is going to hold, because these people are reorientating their view from themselves to outward, to this idea of mishpat, this idea of justice, a just Christmas. They should be. I'm not sure they are, and I'm speaking to myself here just as much as I am to you. Friends, this is our opportunity to pause and take a wider view of the beauty of Christmas that is actually good news for all people. And I kind of have lots of dreams for this church, and I don't know how long I'll be here. I don't know if I'll be here next month, next year, 10 years, 20, 30 years. I don't have a clue, but I dream about the future of this church. And can I just let you in on one of my secret agendas? That years from now, when people talk about Lakeside Church and they talk about Christmas at Lakeside, which we've had some incredible productions, we've done incredible things, and listen, I'm not getting rid of any of those things, okay? Like, I love that we celebrate and make a big deal and welcome our neighbors and our friends, and this year, we're having packages go home for the experience at home and in the room. Like, I love that. I'm not speaking against that, but wouldn't it be neat if when people in our city, just in our city, talked about Christmas at Lakeside, they didn't just mention the amazing production and music and the candlelight and all that stuff, but they actually said, there's something that happens every year at Lakeside where they pause and remember that justice took on flesh in the world, and our city benefits and our world benefits as they look around. And another way that you could put it, wouldn't it be neat if 10, 20, 30 years from now, people looked at Lakeside and said, when those people do Christmas, they think about less under their tree and more for the world. And it's because they value justice as their God values justice. I want that. I want that to be a part of us. And we just thought, as a leadership team, as we met and we just kind of dreamed of what could be and should be, we thought, you know what? Everybody's reinventing Christmas this year. And some of us, we're going to keep some traditions that we have, and some of you are going to ban these after this year. It's like we're going to get through it or whatever. And this year, we just thought, listen, normally at this time of year, we're getting ready for all our celebrations, and we're also kind of our year-end giving. And it's like, don't forget, December 31st, it's a lot, right? And like, that's all a reality. In fact, in this pandemic, it's very much a reality. But we just felt like, why would we just continue to use this season as a time to remind people that we have a need as well? And why not actually shift our attention outward? God's got us. We can trust him. But what if we just, even in the midst of this time, dug down deep and looked outward in our world and thought of the wider view of Christmas, this idea of mishpat, this idea of justice, because Christmas is also the birth of justice in the world. And so we just kind of had this idea of what if every month at Christmas time, as we're celebrating Advent, we actually just every year highlighted one or more local or global charities that we just believe are rock stars in what they're doing in the area of justice. And every year we picked a different one, not because we have commitment issues, but actually because we want to just highlight them, get behind them, give them a breath of fresh air, and then actually allow our individual congregants, if they seem to deeply resonate with serving or giving to that organization, they could continue to do that year after year. And then the next year we could bring another one and invite you to partner with that as well. And so this year we felt, let's just start simple, let's start local. And we just sensed there was something really neat happening in our city, where our city is actually on trajectory and working hard and has declared that they are working to end homelessness for so many vulnerable people who've struggled so much, to end homelessness by 2023. And we thought, like, let's link arms and partner with them. Let's let our city know that we are for them and what they are trying to do. We believe that has a Jesus vibe to it. And so we've actually decided this Christmas, every week, we're going to do different interviews, and we're going to push one thing and one thing only, which is a charity that's been around in our city for 50 years. Longer than most of us have probably lived here or even been alive, called Wyndham House, which is sought to eliminate youth homelessness in our city. And so we're going to let you know different ways that we're going to partner together as a church. But I just want you to have a listen in a moment to an interview I had with their executive director and some of the things that I got to learn. It was a very long conversation, and we got to whittle it down for a few minutes for us to just get a glimpse of what Wyndham House is doing in our city. So would you just watch this quick video? Well, I'm here with Debbie Bentley-Lozon from Wyndham House. Hey, Debbie.
Hi, Mark.
It's great to be with you.
I'm happy to be here.
looking forward to having you in person at Lakeside, but with pandemic, Zoom is as close as we can get. And that is a story for many of us. But you are the executive director at Wyndham House, which has been working to prevent, reduce, and end youth homelessness since 1973 in our city. And many of our people have probably never even heard of Wyndham House. And as you're going to share, that's probably a good thing in some ways. But, you are our Christmas campaign. We're so excited to partner with you. And maybe just give us a 30,000-foot view of if Wyndham House ceased to exist, how would that negatively impact our city?
Okay, so if Wyndham House had to close all of its doors and stop its programming, almost 400 young people would be without critical supports and services that they need, such as housing, food security, access to mental health, addictions, treatment programs, educational opportunities outside of a traditional high school. So I think that we would all know that, young people within ages 16 to 21 need these kind of critical supports in order to thrive and move forward in their lives to become everything that they want to and whatever they dream is possible. So I think that without those supports and services, those opportunities would be lost.
Wow. I've actually met some Lakesiders who've shared stories of decades ago, Wyndham House being a place of refuge when they were in massive crisis with young families. So that's incredible. 47 years. Wyndham House has been around working to prevent, reduce, and I love this word, end youth homelessness. We're meeting with our mayor next week, who's going to be talking about how the city's plan is to end youth homelessness by 2023. And part of me, the realist in me is like, is that just, political talk, or is that an actual possibility? Talk to me about it from your perspective. It's happening.
It's happening in our community. It's really exciting work that's happening to really look at how do we end it. When we talk about ending it, we don't talk about pulling apart the entire shelter system, because there's always going to be a need for shelters. Young people will always have that momentary crisis from time to time where they have no options, no family, no friends to go to. So they may need a short-term shelter bed in order not to be literally on the streets. But really working to be able, when we talk about ending youth homelessness, it talks about being able to manage young people. So if 3 people in our community end up needing shelter services, we can work with those young people to either prevent them from having to leave home if it's safe to stay, or stay with grandma, or stay with an aunt, or find them rapid rehousing, which is tough to do in this market, but during these times. But our community has really taken on this campaign to work at ending or not managing homelessness, but making sure everybody in our community has a safe place to land at the end of the day and can have a bed and adequate housing and access to food security, which is what we want for everyone in our community.
Wow. So that's not just a pie in the sky dream. Like this is something that you see on the horizon.
Yeah, it's not just talk. It's happening. It's exciting.
That is awesome. And
our mayor is a great leader in this campaign as well. So, which a lot of other communities want to work on it, but don't have that leadership at the top, which we're really lucky to have.
Wow. Yeah. Looking forward to our conversation with him next week. Mm-hmm. And so leading up to this first 24 hours, and I know it's like asking what color is the wall. That can be described in any way. What is the thing that leads a youth or young adult to this place where they're so desperate to have a home?
There's so many stories. Everybody it's like that song. Everybody's got a story that could break your heart. But I think it really is just whether they're not safe. I've never met, in 15 years that I've worked at Wyndham House, I have never met a young person who just chooses to be on the street. They just don't. The street life is such a hard life. If they had a safe, welcoming environment that was stable, they would stay there in their home. But there's so many things. So every family has its own stressors and its own story and dance, whether it's functional or it's dysfunctional, and crisis happens, and mental health and addictions, poverty, lots of different struggles. So there's really no one unique pathway into youth homelessness. It sort of bubbles up. And that's where we try and work on the prevention.
Well, one of the things that when we kind of got to know Wyndham House and saw where our city was moving, was we just felt like we wanted to partner with this. And we just believe this is so core to who we are as a church, this idea of justice. And so there's two ways with Bellevue House and then with New Home Kits that we're going to be encouraging our church family to take part in that, because we want to see this happen. We want to see youth homelessness ended.
We're excited to partner as well, Mark. It's great.
As we go, just want to ask you this question. How can we be praying for you specifically? We're going to have a prayer walk praying through the different areas where youth are vulnerable in the city, but how can we be praying for you as you oversee this organization and in the midst of the pandemic?
I love the idea of the prayer walk. When Kim came back and told me about it, I think one of the biggest areas to just kind of keep in mind when saying those prayers is just the hope that young people can find some peace. They need a place where they're welcomed, where they're accepted as they are, not who we would like them to be, and then offered hope and supports in a way that fits what they need, in a way that's respectful of their past, of their future goals, and where they feel safe. And that's, I think, those are the critical aspects.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time, Debbie, and look forward to connecting more in the future.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Can you imagine being known as a city where every young person has a safe place to lay their head at night? Those words, when she said that, she said, these are people who have reached their last place where they have nowhere left that's safe. Many of us have had crisis, but we've had a place to stay that's safe. To be able to create that for an entire city, to be a model city for when other people call and they say, 2024 now, 2025, how did you guys reach this place where you're able to care and reach out immediately and have, available supports to get people back into safe spaces? I want them to say, make sure your churches are in it too. Make sure your churches are prayer walking through the streets. Make sure they are totally invested. I want that to be our legacy. And this year we get to be a part of that. And when I asked her, I said, can we just pray? I never know how that question's gonna go. And she's like, yes. And pray for peace. I'm like, we got that. And on Peace Sunday and Advent, that works perfectly. We will do that. And so here's 3 things we're gonna do, friends. Number 1, we're gonna have prayer walk kits that are gonna be in one of the many things that are gonna be in your Christmas box. And so over the Christmas season, if you or some friends or family wanna go for a prayer walk throughout different parts of our city where youth are vulnerable and pray over that, we would love that. Okay, that's gonna be an incredible thing. And you can also do that from home if you're not able to go out. All the prayer requests are gonna be there. They've actually made the prayer requests for us. They were so grateful that we were gonna do that. Second thing is I'm inviting you. Some of you love shopping. You're like, I don't have any shopping to do. I'm not making a big meal. And so they actually have this thing called New Home Kits. It's on our website under the Christmas tab next to Wyndham House, New Home Kits. And she was just sharing with me in our longer form of the interview just how many of these youth, they get them stable, they get them connected, and then they give them a new home, and it's like they don't even have bed sheets. And so these New Home Kits, you may decide I'm gonna get one item the next time I'm at the grocery store, or I'm gonna make a whole home kit. However you wanna do that, we're gonna be collecting them. You can drop them off anytime when our office is open, and we'll have them out in the atrium. But whether that's double bed sheets, pillows, blankets, don't write this down, by the way, it's all on our website on the Christmas tab, but towels, cutlery, dishes, and glassware. And I love this. She said for 2 to 4 people. And when she explained it, she said, listen, like we often are safe because we have community we can rely on, and we're trying to help these youth build community. And so having someone over for dinner and being able to serve them on a plate is such a powerful thing, right? So cleaning supplies, simple pots and pans, shower curtains, socks, grocery gift cards. So if you'd love to make a part of or a whole home kit and that excites you, you love the idea of creating gifts, you have gift giving as one of your, spiritual gifts, like please take part in that. You can take your family or maybe even your kids with you too, if that's an interactive way to do that, like a really tangible way to show them and come drop it off as a family outing. That's a great idea. And the third thing is to actually donate. Some of you, this has been a really hard year and financially you're strapped, and others financially, you've done actually very well this year and you've just been kind of looking. Bellevue House is one of their sites. They have many sites all throughout the city, and at any given time, they are always housing 8 young people who are in transition. The average stay is about 8 months at Bellevue House, as they get training, as they get mental health care, all these things to build them up so that they're ready to live on their own. Since the year 2000, Bellevue House alone has had over 700 young people live in this house. Now, I want you to just think, if you know someone or have had young people grow up in your house, you know that by the time they leave, you need a renovation. Imagine if you had 700 of them. Okay, so they're in desperate need of renovation, and they got contractors putting up walls that are, concrete board instead of drywall. Like, they're just making it indestructible. And that project is underway, and it's a $70,000 project, give or take. And they're about $25,000 short at this moment. It's changing every day. And I would just love for us to be able to jump on that, and by Christmas time for that project to be fully funded, to create a safe space where youth can immediately be cared for, trained up, healed, given the mental health care they need, and actually taught to live on their own and given different supports. And so 3 different ways: praying, new home kits, and donating. And all the information and even the direct giving link is all under the Christmas tab for Wyndham House. Friends, can you imagine how this could change, and we could actually be kind of a multiplicative impact on other cities to get them around this idea of creating safe spaces for everyone? That's our dream for this just Christmas. As you go, I want to just remind you of a few things. The moment this feed dies, if you're at home, pull out your phone right away and just make your Christmas greeting. If it's just you or you and your pet, just say Merry Christmas from us. If it's you and the family, you don't need a fancy stand. Just do it at the extent of your arm and just upload it again on the Christmas tab on our website. If you'd like prayer, our prayer teams are going to be up at each cross in the building. And if you're on our website, you can click the prayer tab and someone will get back to you, ready to pray with you. And we would love to do that. And lastly, again, kids, artwork, Christmas tab, color it up. Adults, you can print your own and color it up too. You might not make it into the Christmas Eve slideshow, but I love coloring. There's something about staying in the lines that just makes me feel secure in life. As you go, can I just bless you? If you're in the room, would you stand? It's Peace Sunday. Jesus says, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. It wasn't once things get better, then you will have peace, or once I reply to your prayer request, then you will have peace. He spoke peace to people who were struggling, who were oppressed, who were in a difficult time. And so I just speak peace over you. May this peace of the Spirit reside in your hearts today. Go in Jesus' name.